welcoming back one of my favorite people. We have Michael Flem back with us. He wrote a fascinating book, Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy, about a year and a half ago. I think we had him on about a year ago. And what makes this book not only a good read, and also a powerful statement about our past is Michael is not a casual writer. He is a professor of history and philosophy, and he is a very good I shouldn't say field, he's a good researcher in compiling ancient data about our past, and he is really focused on Atlantis. So we're talking this version, Cultural Curiosities of Atlantis, and you'll find out pretty quickly what we're talking about. But there's a lot of details that we missed last time just because the book is so well written and so packed with data. So Michael, welcome back to Earth Ancients. How you doing, man?
Hey, Cliff, thank you for having me back.
You're in Monterrey, right?
Yeah, Monterrey, Mexico.
What's the weather like?
Right now, it's kind of rainy, kind
Is
of
it
London.
rainy?
Yeah.
Okay, because
Fog.
we're cooking in the United States.
Yeah, it's rain and fog.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Up in the mountains. Yep.
So what's their elevation there? Are you higher than 2,500?
Think we're close to that. Yeah, something quite high. Not as high, I believe, as Mexico City, but pretty high.
So I would think that you're like, no, we're cooking like you guys, but you're having rain. I would
Yeah.
never think of that rain. So
Yeah.
you got to actually, is it raining the whole week or off
I
and
think
on?
so. Yeah, it's been just dreary, like London fog, heavy fog in the morning. Can't even see the mountains. Yeah.
Is this what the locals say is typical for this time of year, or is this global warming?
This city is it's the craziest weather you've ever seen, and it's always been that way. It's like it could be 95 degrees one day and then 62 and raining, and then a week later hail, a week later back to sunny, and then snow in the winter sometimes. So it's was wild.
I didn't know that.
I didn't either.
So you've been there like 3 years, and it's been like that since day one?
Day one. Yeah. You always have to, in Monterey, you always have to have a jacket, a tank top, a pair of pants, and a pair of shorts ready to go, because you never know when you get up in the morning. Okay,
I was going to say, and you have in your backpack a umbrella.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. For the sun or the rain. Yes, that's true. Yep.
Let's talk about this wonderful book. I want to start with some of the people that you research. Helene Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and of course, Edgar Cayce. When we talk about these individuals, we're talking about people who were thinking not only outside of the box, but they were actually seeking some idea about Atlantis, weren't they?
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I would say, in order of weight that I placed on each of these in terms of how much I talked about them, I would say the book really focused heavily on the works of Edgar Cayce. Probably second to that would be people like Rudolf Steiner, and a couple obscure people that people might not remember, like Frederick Oliver, who was this 17-year-old clairvoyant kid who discovered he was clairvoyant through a very strange experience he had around Mount Shasta that led to him writing this crazy 400-page legacy of Atlantis called A Dweller on Two Planets that, bizarrely corroborates much of what other people said. And then, of course, you got people like Helena Blavatsky and stuff that I don't spend too much time on personally, because there have been so many books on, theosophy and its connections to Atlantis. And I of course address it, but I really wanted to see, not just like, okay, Edgar Cayce said this and then assume that's absolutely true, which a lot of books, they just presume the reader is familiar with Edgar Cayce and understands clairvoyance and takes it at face value. I approached it really as a skeptic myself. I came from the academic world. I was familiar, like most people, with psychics and clairvoyance, but it was actually my own book that convinced me that this was actually compelling evidence. So the book for me was like a personal investigation of the subject of Atlantis, and also a kind of introduction for other skeptics of why we should take these kinds of channeled or remote viewed or clairvoyant, broadly speaking, images and evidence just as seriously as we take what we call so-called hard evidence like archaeology
I'm glad you
and things
brought
like
that
that.
up, Michael, because I've had a number of Native Americans, and most notably Dr. Phyllis from Canada, who is
Hmm.
a native archaeologist, who is using word of mouth, historical notions, tribal traditions between different indigenous groups in the United States to verify that people lived in the United States up to 150,000 years ago.
Wow.
And she's redating these sites to show that they're very old. So that's something that we need to really begin looking at a little closer. I want to ask you about something that Steiner and Cayce, obviously, and Blavatsky use, which is the Akashic Records.
Hmm.
How do we, I mean, that's a really hard one for me because I've had a lot of experts on my show and they're like, well, all you got to do is tap in and tweak a
Yeah,
little bit. And it's like, what are you talking about?
right.
How did these guys access this so-called database?
That's a great question. And I don't presume to know the answer or to personally be a clairvoyant. I just know what they said. And I tried to make as much sense of it given, modern discoveries about reality and philosophical discoveries about or theories about how reality works. But according to people like Cayce, he was directly asked that actually by an intern. What is this thing you're doing? How does it function? He explains it in this extremely lengthy kind of soliloquy in a trance that I put in the book and I quote verbatim. And it's fascinating. And I won't even paraphrase it, but it's basically like, it's interesting because Akasha in Sanskrit means sky or ether.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting that, years later we discovered or developed the Ethernet, which, is if you want to consider it, modern technological recreation of cloud storage and things. And we decided to call it the Akasha net or Ethernet. And these people 100 years ago, in Edgar Cayce's case, in the 20s and 30s, were saying, look, there's already a natural cosmic cloud called the Akashic Records. That's kind of, Cayce said, like a magnetic quasi-physical template that encodes all lived experience, that nothing can really escape once it's been completed or even thought in some way, that all potentialities that have played out on time are encoded in this thing he called the Akashic Records, and that different people can access it in different ways. Like he had to go into a self-induced trance, deep trance in a coma state, and then be woken up very, very slowly after he gave what he called his sources, reading.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, Steiner, I think, just went into deep meditative states.
Right.
And then people like Frederick Oliver were allegedly hearing almost like echoes from the Akashic record that were telling him to write their story. Again, I don't pretend. I take an extremely skeptical approach to the whole book. And most of, the people that have read it and written reviews and letters say that they really appreciate that because I don't really say anything has to be this way or that way. I just really tried to show people, look, this isn't just some call this number now, Miss Cleo hotline. This is a very serious subject that, in the case of Oliver, Cayce, and Steiner, a lot of the things they discovered through clairvoyance later proved to be true. For example, just a clear example, Cliff, Edgar Cayce was once asked about the geography of Africa. And I think this was in the 30s. And he said, the Nile used to actually run across Central Africa from its current headwaters and empty into the Atlantic near the Congo coast. In 1986, NASA satellite imaging proved that that's true and found an underground river system that actually traversed Central Africa and went into the Atlantic near the Congo side of Africa. And there are many more cases that I cite in the book where, clairvoyants or psychics, whatever you want to call them, have later been verified by archaeology, geology, satellite imagery. And perhaps the most glaring example that really shocked me was when Frederick Oliver, writing in 1886, when the mid-Atlantic ridge had just been discovered, but nobody had a clear image of what it looked like, drew a picture of what he said was the final Atlantean island of Poseid. And then I superimposed that over a modern bathythermic map near the Azores, and it's identical. And it's like, okay, these are not just kind of random guesses.
Yeah.
And this is something else at work, which I guess you would call accessing the Akashic Records.
I don't know if everyone's supposed to be able to access this database. I call it cloud computing, the Akashic Records. And like I said, I've had people on the show said, "Oh, sure, all you got to do is meditate." And I don't think it's made for everybody. I think there's certain interpreters, we'll just call them librarians, who can actually go in and access this data. I want to talk a little bit about what Cayce calls the three phases of Atlantis. And you do a very good job in the book with showing the actual land masses. And it's funny because the very first one is a landmass that's 1 million BC. That's the earlier phase, right?
That map, that's interesting. That's a map that Rudolf Steiner, and his his anthroposophical group, they proposed that was the timeline of Atlantis. And they take it back to about 1 million BC. Cayce takes it back, as far as I can tell from all of his readings, I think the earliest iteration he mentions is about 100 or 150,000 BC.
Right.
Which is the date I kind of suggest for possible what could be called later Atlantis. But really, I stick to the conservative date of 50,000 BC because that's when Cayce says there had already existed this civilization with a named king and a city in the kind of later configuration that we believe would be destroyed, about 40,000 years after that fact, around 10,000 BC. But in the case of the three stages, it's interesting because for Cayce, there were three destructions. And what was Atlantis originally was a much larger continent that Cayce basically said stretched from, what you would call the coast of Portugal today, the Azores, down through the mid-Atlantic ridge where it is today, and kind of stretching into Cuba even, And then there was a initial destruction, Cayce said around 50,000 BC, which was man-made. It was a cataclysm, and I'll save that for the book because that's a wild one, how that was caused. And then he says it broke into 5 islands that were still big. Mm-hmm. And then after that, there was a second destruction. He puts around 28,000 BC, and that led to 3 islands. And of those 3, one was called Poseid, and that's what I believe Plato was referencing. Okay. So when we say Atlantis, many people call it the lost city, or many people say, well, it was just this global culture. So I tried to really spend a lot of time in the book narrowing down, what are we exactly talking about? And what I discovered is it's kind of like how there's the British Empire, but then there's England, and then there's London,
Yeah.
And they're not all the same. And I think there's a lot of confusion where it's according to Cayce and Frederick Oliver, and to my knowledge, a few other people that were clairvoyant that mentioned Atlantis, at the final configuration around, let's say, 12,000 BC, there were 3 islands, Poseid, Og, and Cayce calls the third one Arion. And I picked Poseid as the one Plato was talking about because in Plato's account of the capital, there's a statue of Poseidon in the middle of the capital, which is a circular city. And that's also where Cayce identifies the circular city. And that's also where Frederick Oliver says the circular city of the capital of Poseid of the Atlantean Empire, which had colonies all over parts of the Mediterranean and North and South America. So I just wanted to clarify that there's multiple iterations of this civilization, according to these people, that span almost 40,000 years.
Right.
And it did in some way stretch throughout the world.
Yeah, well, that's where we come in. Those are satellites, right?
Exactly.
So we would say Cayce believes that the Maya were once part or perhaps early Atlanteans. And then from my point of view, it's a multicultural race. We don't just see
Right.
Caucasians, we see African-centric, Asian-centric, European-centric people
That's
coming
right.
to what is now Mexico, which is very
Absolutely.
hard for anthropologists and archaeologists to even consider, because then we're talking about cross-Atlantic, cross-Pacific
Right.
migrations, and they can't deal with that.
Yeah, and in fact, in the latter chapter of Visions of Atlantis, I talk about how Cayce describes the migrations to, say, the Yucatan, which he says, at the final destruction, shortly before the final destruction, which again wasn't a day and a night, like a lot of people think it's like, a tidal wave came and lightning flashed and that's it. It's like, according to Cayce, the civilization declined during that 1,200-year cataclysmal cycle that people like Babu Dev Mishra cite in their Yuga cycle,
Yeah.
which was that 1,200-year window where it's like, okay, we're going through an earthly major cleansing by water. But it wasn't one day this happened. Even Cayce said, at one point, 2 of the islands were fine, but one was experiencing, major erosion from storms. And then it got to, I'm sure there was one day, just like if you said, well, when did the Roman Empire end? It's like, did it end at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on this Thursday? It's like, no, it was ending for weeks before and months and years, arguably. And I think it's the same. And so when you look at it, Cayce explained these anomalies. Like, for example, you mentioned the Yucatan, and I would even add the Basque people who don't speak an Indo-European language, but whose language is closer to the Yucatec language and Azteca languages, which should not exist if we're all separate across the Atlantic until Columbus. And so Cayce was actually, what's really interesting, Cliff, was that this book actually, most people think Atlantis is a fantastical idea, but the fantastical idea is explaining cross-cultural similarities without a large Atlantic island that allows you to navigate
the mother
ocean.
culture.
That's much harder to explain. With Atlantis, it actually makes perfect sense because you've got first the continent, then the 5 islands, then the 3. And if you add Frederick Oliver's accounts, you've even got high technology, including flying devices, submarines, and wireless technology, which again, he described in The Wild West in 1886. He was describing cell phones, holographs.
I bought that book and I have it on a shelf somewhere and I didn't look at it, but now you're making me think I better read that thing to come up to speed.
Good luck with that one. Good luck.
Is it a challenge? I think you even said it's tough to read, right?
It's a wild book. I don't even know. You're going to just have to call me after you finish it.
It's all over the place. Is that why?
It's one of the craziest books I've ever read in my life. Period. There's nothing like it.
Wow.
There's nothing like it. No.
Let's talk about the science, the physics and science of these early versions. Cayce, I believe, said that it was, over thousands of years in the second phase, that they became very adept at using technology. There were machines and certain types of devices that flew and went under the ocean.
Right.
What do we know? What do we sense was the level of their technology?
That's a really big part of the book. And it's something I spent a lot of time really trying to qualify, because you got to remember, you got to kind of start backwards. And it's unfortunate, but, even Atlantean aluminum, which Frederick Oliver said they were using, even Atlantean aluminum from Atlantis Home Depot doesn't last 12,000 years. So we're not going to have that, and I know a lot of people want that. They want to find, the Hall of Records with an intact Atlantean veil cigar-shaped craft, which, look, I'm not saying it's impossible. They could have stored one in a special place, but the evidence for all the kind of superficial infrastructure would not exist. And we would just see what we see today, which is megalithic ruins and anomalies that cultures don't understand. But in Frederick Oliver's account, by 11,000 BC, when his story takes place, and again, he's channeling a deceased Atlantean named Philos's account, and he's 17 years old. And again, I understand most people roll their eyes and say, why would you take this person seriously? And I would say, well, read the book 7 times and annotate it and see if you can explain how a 17-year-old kid wrote on a level of Einstein and Tesla when he's describing magnetism and electricity, and how he didn't have a secret contributor, and how he published this book before any of these inventions came out in the Western world.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very difficult to explain how a kid in 1886 knew about holographic, you know, technology, knew about television, knew about smartphones, knew about repulsor lifts that, you know, carried people across the town and stuff. And that's how he describes it. It's basically kind of like a combination of Star Wars and, you know, the Fifth Element in many ways. That way he describes the, you know, cities. It's like he's describing the capital city in 11,000 BC, which he claims was the peak before the fall. And he says, you know, they had a monorail system, very similar to, you know, traveling through Busch Gardens or Disney when you go on the monorail. He describes it exactly like that, but before monorails existed, of course. And he said it was one car that held 2 people, and you put a token in and it took you to, you know, see the governor. And he went through this excruciating detail of like how many plots of land each Atlantean citizen was given, if they were this age, and what the college system was like, and how the science worked, and how they weren't religious the way Christians are religious, that they believed that, you know, there was no savior, but that we were all equal under Inkal, which they called the solar sun, and how the sun to them was not just a cold thing in the sky. It was a consciousness that gave life to all things on earth and drove evolution, and how if you understood how the sun and the moon really worked, you would be able to harness magnetism and unlock all these mysteries that, you know, we had back then. And so it's a fascinating book because it really like enjoins readers to not just open their minds, but I'm talking about A Dweller on Two Planets. I hope mine does the same. I'm not showing off, but you know, it's this very kind of sad tone because it's bemoaning the loss of this really advanced, sophisticated, quite spiritual culture. And Philos, the person he's channeling, is saying, you know, one day you will rediscover this and you'll enjoy so many of the conveniences we enjoyed, but just make sure you don't abuse them the way they became abused later on. Because according to Frederick Oliver, one of the causes of the downfall of Atlantis was the elite and the leaders basically stole all the technology and power for themselves and kind of left the common people, who over generations forgot how to build the infrastructure that sustained them. And so they lost the airplanes, they lost the submarines, they lost this. And then he said eventually the elite just became, as he quotes, as electricity. Like they just became like transhumanists and disappeared and left the people to themselves, who then descended into basically a Bronze Age type culture. And that's the group that I believe Plato's describing when he says they sailed back into the Mediterranean and fought against the Greeks in this, or the Athenians, or proto-Athenians, whatever, in this alleged war between Athena and the Atlanteans, who he describes as basically Bronze Age people. You know, and
that's weird. So they de-evolved,
yes,
from a very high civilization over thousands of years, I guess.
Thousands of years, yes.
Wow. I never heard that.
When I hadn't either. And it was the perfect explanation, because so many critics say this high technology Atlantis is just a bunch of new age BS after Star Wars that you're crowbarring onto Plato's account, as if, first of all, Plato is the only person that spoke about this, which is not true. But that account from Frederick Oliver actually perfectly explains why some people describe high technology and some people describe, like Plato, chariots and triremes and, you know, Bronze Age type warfare. Because, you know, it's just like if today there was a, you know, terrible loss of infrastructure, I don't know how to build an Abrams tank, and you don't know how to fly an F-16 probably. So if I wanted to get your resources, I'm going to fight with a shield and a sword and maybe a horse or something, something I know. And so it's actually quite logical, and that's what really shocked me, Cliff, was how logical so many of these clairvoyant explanations were when you just sat back and thought about it. Like, okay, let's just presume they're telling the truth. Let's look at the evidence. And 90% of the time when I looked at where, for example, Edgar Cayce said something, and then I looked at what Frederick Oliver said and Rudolf Steiner, they never collaborated. And they're all talking about very similar
which
things.
I love to hear this, Michael.
Yeah.
And we haven't talked about this before. In the similar matter that we get this new revelation from indigenous sources, oral traditions are referenced, and they all collaborate a statement or a thought. You're saying that this channel information that you researched is collaboratory, it's collaborative.
It is.
Which is amazing.
It is. And what's even weirder is after I've published the book, I was exhausted after 7 years, but I still kept, curiously, the thrill wasn't gone yet, so to speak. And so I still was like, what else did I miss? Can I update it on Amazon before I publish it? But I read the whole Dolores Cannon Convoluted Universe series after I published the book. And I was like, wow, so many things she said that I never cited her in my book from her clients that weren't, interested in Atlantis. They were just giving hypnotic regressions, and she was taking transcripts, also corroborated things Edgar Cayce said and went into even more detail. And I know you wanted to talk about Atlantean curiosities. And one of the things,
got there yet, buddy. We haven't got there yet.
Right. And one of those, curiosities, let's say, was, definitely elaborated on in Dolores Cannon's work in a way that I had never seen, because I thought Edgar Cayce was one of the only sources of that particular curiosity in Atlantis, which again lends more credibility just from a scientific method perspective to the claim that there is some truth to these readings,
It's a good segue into our next topic, which is the brilliance of Atlantean science as geneticists. And I want to talk a little bit about what Cayce called piezoelectric or crystal energy, because it apparent. And I want you to, if you can give us some hints or some references from the book. Apparently, they developed a very strong ability to use piezoelectric energy in all their engines, all their flying vehicles, all their submarines and cars. What else did they use it for?
Yeah, Cayce again was limited by the language of his time,
right?
And so in one time he's describing essentially nuclear weapons, for example, but there's no word nuclear weapons in 1920 that's commonly known. So he'll say things like the splitting of the atom or things like this. And the same with, piezoelectric power. He'll say things like they harness the power of the crystal, he'll say frequently. And you got to kind of plug in the gaps with like the work of Christopher Dunn and other people who have really studied this as engineers. But I cite a guy who was a NASA physicist who actually studied the Edgar Cayce readings on the crystal. And I almost cite his entire response to that because it was impossible to paraphrase. And I wanted to show people how serious some people took this subject. And he basically said that this enormous crystal, which Cayce said was in a kind of lighthouse with a refracting dome, gathered stellar energy, not just from the sun, but from different planets, different solar bodies, basically, and stored it in underground energy store tanks, essentially, and then kind of radiated that energy locally, but also broadcast a wireless energy signal, kind of like a Wardenclyffe Tower Tesla type thing.
Interesting.
And that the flying machines entrained to pre-program flight routes. And so you could travel on the crystal, much like a lighthouse beacon. So it was a wireless energy using crystals. and a solar component was involved. And then he said also in people's homes, they could regulate temperature through this as well. He said it could project heat or cold by differentials in your crystal in your home that was miniature and training with it, and it would heat up or cool your home. So it was always nice temperature in your home, and they used it for illumination. But he said finally, you know, fatally, it was this kind of multi-purpose tool, just like you can use nuclear energy for a power plant or a weapon. And it was, you know, one time accidentally mistuned, and he says that was the cause of the second destruction. And in other times, it was purposely used as a kind of Death Star weapon of sorts. Now, I don't know, is it able to be proven? No. But it's quite compelling, given what Christopher Dunn has, you know, found in the Great Pyramid, which, you know, he believes was a kind of similar design in a different shape of, maybe he didn't even say this, but that's what I would say if I met Christopher Dunn, is that, you know, according to Cayce, Giza was a Atlantis reboot from 10,500 BC. Yeah. And so it would make sense that they would directly take their original power source and do it in Giza.
We could get into Egypt and spend a whole show just talking about some of that stuff. That's amazing. I want to talk about the genetic engineering that was taking place, and you hinted on it on our last interview. Cayce talks about it, but towards the end, it seemed like these Atlanteans were getting to be power hungry, and they kind of bent the morals a bit, and not only developing probably enhancements to their own physiology. And I'd be interested about what you learned in that side, but also creating creatures which became myths. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's something that I really spent a long time writing that chapter, because it's so bizarre that even I had to pull myself back and say, okay, look, you know, be as conservative as you can in this chapter. You know, they've already think you're crazy. But also take it seriously, because who knows what we're really dealing with here. And so, you know, in Cayce's explanation, you know, he says that, because somebody once asked him, like, what's the origin of all life on Earth? You know, it wasn't just questions about Atlantis. They asked him questions about medieval times, but somebody one time asked him, like, when did consciousness first come to Earth and how? And he describes basically like, kind of similar to the book of Genesis account of, you know, fallen angel type thing, where he's like, basically, he doesn't use that terminology, but he basically says, like, you know, there were entities, thought forms that were like amoebas that didn't have physicality, and they came to Earth to play around. And so some of them became rocks and created what he called the mineral kingdom. Some became plants, and he says they entangled with the existing flora and fauna of the earth and minerals. And then some of them became trapped in materiality. But they still had this consciousness that we would call semi-human. And he says it's from that, which he puts at like millions of years ago, that there was this kind of the thing that Genesis describes with the children of the daughters of men, and this fallen angels and the Nephilim and Rephaim and all of this mutants running around the world with red hair and giants and whatever the hell happened back then. Yeah. But Cayce says that, you know, this wasn't just mythology, that there were this like remnant population of half human, half satyr, ogre, man with a horse's rear end, and you know, all the things that we mythologized. And in fact, one lady asked him, like, she was curious about this. And he said, well, you know, a lot of these hybrids were still alive and able to reproduce at the time of Atlantis. And he says a lot of the people of Atlantis, like, there were a group of people that you kind of call eugenicists today in a way, who really worked to perfect the form of the human body, that Cayce says we as Homo sapiens later considered, the standard human, like relatively hairless as far as body hair, certain height, certain features of, we don't have claws anymore. Most of us don't have fangs and things like that. And he said that was actually a selective Atlantean process that went on in different times, but that there were always groups of people who like to get down with the hybrid, so to speak, and, got into kinky stuff with the, satyrs and all sorts of things. And that they were able at that point, I guess, to have sort of genetically viable offspring. And so that was one element of the mixtures, as he called them. But then there was what you described, which was this kind of genetic, actual, like Nazi scientist type of, malicious program that was breeding a kind of subhuman class to be used as slaves in the fields or servants. And many
was
times
that actually true when Cayce writes about a servitude class that was created by the Atlanteans?
That's right. And he says some of them were pre-existing hybrids that were just kind of like in the wild, that weren't intelligent enough to know really what was going on, that were used by the what you would call Homo sapien class to do manual labor, which is bizarre, Cliff, because in Dolores Cannon's readings, and there is no connection where her clients were reading these obscure Edgar Cayce readings. In some of their past lives, some of them describe sitting at the dinner table and, people with hooves serving them. And then they wake up out of their trance and Dolores says, okay, this is what you said. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even understand. There's a goat person that's my waiter. What are you talking about?
Weird.
It is weird. So that was one aspect. And Cayce said they even brought them to Atlantis, or excuse me, to Giza during these kind of, centuries of decline where they knew the island was going to be destroyed eventually because they had been studying astronomy and expected the comet and the flood that likely destroyed them in the final destruction. And Cayce says they brought these hybrids to Egypt. And this is the weirdest part, I think, of the Cayce readings, where he says they built 2 temples in Giza that remained to be discovered. I think he said one of them was underground as a pyramid, but it was buried. And he said one was called the Temple of Sacrifice and the Temple Beautiful. And he says not sacrifice like human sacrifice. He says this was a rehabilitation center for people that were hybridized or mixed to sacrifice their animal proclivities and become more like a quote unquote proper human.
So they're gene splicing temple? Is that what that?
So I'll get to that. So that temple, he said, was like this educational rehabilitation center where they taught these people how to behave without without being vulgar, using your animal proclivities in inappropriate situations if you're a horseman or a dog man or a goat man or whatever. In the second temple, the lady straight up asked him, she says, Edgar Cayce, please describe the surgical procedures used to rehabilitate in the Temple of Sacrifice. And he said, with the bloodless knife that can coagulate while it cuts, so like a lightsaber type thing, and he says, what you would call today modern surgery, or quote, removing a paw and replacing it with an organic human hand. And she said, how many generations did it take until their offspring would be fully human? And he said, wow. It wasn't possible until like 5 children had been born in grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and then eventually, and he says, and some people today still have traces of those animal appendages if you still look closely. And I've always thought that, because I've always looked around and said, that person looks a little bit like this or that animal. Did we all really just come from monkeys? I don't know.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I want to talk briefly about the sexual perversions of these Atlanteans.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about it, and I think it's important that you talk about it. Of course, you didn't bring it up in the book because you probably get an X rating, but genital enhancement.
I did tell about it in the book a little bit.
Okay. But I mean, they were into perversions where they were actually creating a sex slave race, which I
Yeah.
think is because if these beings are coming in with any form of consciousness, and this is the thing that's really crazy, we are conscious beings, but if we create a test tube entity,
Hmm.
do they have a consciousness? And it's hard to say in your
Right.
description of these sex slaves if they were consciously aware of being used
Hmm.
for pleasure.
That's a great question. And I don't know if I could conclusively even explain, what consciousness truly means. But I take your point. Like, you know, I come up with that reading because, or that commentary that you said on the sex slaves, because in one Edgar Cayce reading, which it's very funny because the reading was done on D-Day, June 6, 1944. And this guy, for some reason, didn't get deployed to Normandy. And he decides, I'm going to go get an Edgar Cayce reading on my past life because his wife said, you should go see this man, Mr. Cayce. He's a miracle worker. And so he asks him, because he's like, I'm having trouble in my current life with my girlfriend, and I think I'm a sex addict and everything. And so Edgar Cayce goes into a trance on his couch, which again sounds fantastical, but he just could induce a deep sleep very quickly within 5 to 10 minutes just by sitting on his couch. And then he would begin to speak in this kind of monotone voice. And a stenographer wrote down everything he said and put it in an archive. And so directly from the archives, this kid said, tell me my past life and anything that might help me in my current life. And he says, this is the kind of person that, goes to the extreme in everything. And he says something like, and I think you know what I'm talking about. The kind of person that gets what he wants with the ladies, because Cayce was, like you said before the show, a very conservative Baptist Christian who didn't want to offend people's sensibilities. So you got to plug it in what he's talking about. But in one time he says, okay, I'm taking you back to the times of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. And he says, your name in that iteration was this Spanish name. And he says, and you didn't treat those conquered native women very well now, did you? And he goes, and in fact, 2 of them committed suicide because of what you did to them. You remember that now, don't you? Then he takes him back to an even further iteration where it's basically like this kind of like a Sodom and Gomorrah. Cayce always refers to it as the city on the hills and the plain, which a lot of people think he's talking about kind of that area of Sodom and Gomorrah from biblical times. And he's like, yes, the same pattern was repeated here. Here, you ran a caravan route. And he goes, and you remember what you did with those slave girls that came through on the caravan route, don't you? And he goes, but nothing compares to your iteration in the second, I think it was, destruction timeline of Atlantis. And he says, when you at the time were this ultra powerful, almost like wizard scientist who was a geneticist. And he says, and you made women in all forms, all shapes, some grotesque, some beautiful, but all to your sick liking.
Oh, wow.
With no concern for their feelings of how their bodies looked. So you can imagine, just he made some grotesque, big assed woman, humongous boobed woman with a super thin waist. I mean, whatever sick fantasy Cayce was describing. And he said, basically, look, you're a sex addict and your mission, your karma is to kind of overcome this ultra intense feeling you have when you are around women. And who knows if there was a follow-up or not. I don't know.
That's amazing. But isn't there also a passage where he's talking about the kind of demented phase where sexual excess was the norm?
Yeah, there's 2 passages. Since you want to embarrass me, Cliff, and put me on the spot here.
Yeah, we want you to lose your PhD.
You want me to? I only have a master's, so I only have nothing to lose.
The university's listening, so don't worry.
No. Yeah, I'll lose more than that, right?
But you can dial it down any way you want.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't care. I don't. I'm done. I'm done with that phase of my life. I'm already an apostate for writing this book in academia, I'm sure. But, you know, he mentions that it wasn't just perverted guys. You know, there were a lot of women, because in a lot of these stories, you get the sense that their society, in most of its iterations, the first, second, and third, you know, phases, which lasted tens of thousands of years, that women actually rose to positions of extreme power. You know, and a lot of people say that's more evidence of why certain Egyptian dynasties valued queens as much as they valued pharaohs, because it was a holdover from this egalitarian Atlantean kind of not matriarchal society, but they valued powerful women. And it wasn't just women were victims and men ruled the world and all this. And a lot of these women were not innocent either. You know, like one of the ladies that comes in for a reading, Edgar Cayce says, he says, you know, you used to be a woman on the Chicago frontier, and your name was May Umbor. And what May wanted, May got. And you know what I mean by that. With the traders, with the priests, with the young boys that were guarding the fort. You know what I mean by that. And then he took her back and he said, but at the beginning, you were this Atlantean priestess who was so respected that you could have 17 kids with 17 different men and they still couldn't impeach you from the temple because you were so good at what you did.
Wow.
And he would end with, and we are done here. And then the transcript would be given to you and you'd go home and go, what the hell was that all about?
Oh, Jesus. It's funny how Cayce presents the data. It's very, it's conservative, but it has strong meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know, even weirder were the readings that Phyllis Schlemmer, who I only talk about briefly in the book, but, you know, she was a clairvoyant who claimed to be in contact with an intergalactic federation. In fact, she advised Gene Roddenberry when he was creating Star Trek. They were best friends. And she wrote a book called The Only Planet of Choice in 1994, which was a collection of channelings she claims she did in her home in the 70s. And it's from those readings that you get these very, very strong warnings about the Atlantean excess. And one of them was, you know, some guys asking her as she's in a channeled state, you know, why did Atlantis fall? And she goes into, you know, politics, this and that. And she says something like, you know, they got a lot of things right. They had the greatest scientists, the greatest healthcare, but if they could only keep, you know, their minds above the waist, they would have lived a lot longer as a civilization. And the guy presses her like, well, what are you talking about? And she's like, phallic enhancement became this out of control competitive thing among the elite. And, you know, I say in my book, I'm like, you don't think for a second if that technology existed today, that wouldn't be going on at the top
Phallic
levels.
enhancement.
If it cost $1 million, you're telling me there's not people that would be doing that until, you know, whatever they get to. And she really said that. And you know, other weird references that I kind of picked up here, picked up there from very strange sources, clairvoyant sources, allude to this like genetic, you know, that one group, like the Sons of Belial, Edgar Cayce called them, became these kind of genetically modified sexual perverts. And Cayce once described it as, you know, who lived in the most beautiful temples without, but evil and, you know, sin within. You can imagine like a Epstein Island, but in Atlantis kind of thing going on.
Epstein Island.
Yeah. So again, God. I always say nothing new under the sun, right? From Ecclesiastes. I think it's like, it really is kind of like Babu, you know, Dev Misra and Yuga Shift says, it's kind of, we're in a circle. We're in a 25,000 year cycle.
Yeah.
That, you know, looks different maybe every time, but it's like the same themes that kind of come back. It's like people get rich, corrupt, perverted, excess blows up. And then we've seen that in recorded history. How many times? So why would it be any different 12,000 years ago, you know?
The book's called Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. This is the second time we've had Michael Flem on the program. As always, it's been a pleasure Hey man, thanks for giving me a couple hours today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Cliff. Thank you so much.